Okay, so this week we are going to talk about something called the Texas Revolution. Last week and part of this week we've looked at the different routes to the West, people moving to the West, and this concept called manifest destiny, which was the idea that that Americans were destined, or that it was God's will for Americans to move all the way from the East Coast of the country all the way to the West Coast in what is today California, Oregon, Washington. And so the reason why many people move to the West, along with all of the things that we looked at last week, people moved to the West a lot of times because they really felt like it was their destiny to move towards the West Coast as Americans. And part of that manifest destiny fits into what we call the Texas Revolution. And so we're going to tell that story a little bit today, and then you'll take a quiz at the end of this video. The Mexicans gained their independence from the Spanish in 1821. The Spanish, if you remember back to the very beginning of the year, we learned about the European countries coming to the Americas, and the Spanish had a lot of influence in Central America and somewhat in South America, and they came up what is today the western part of the United States. And so they controlled a lot of the area of what is Mexico, and then in what is today the United States, in Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, and even into California. The Spanish basically turn over Mexico back to the Mexican people, and they gained their independence in 1821 after some fighting. And the Mexicans realized that they needed people to come live in their country if their country was going to survive. And so they tried to recruit Americans to come to their country and settle the land. And so they gave out great deals on land, either for totally free or very, very cheap prices. And they sent recruiters to the United States, to cities like Cincinnati and St. Louis and New Orleans and other cities, to try to recruit people to come and live in the Mexican territory. And these people were called empresarios. And the empresarios, their job was to go into these cities and find families and recruit them to come live in Mexico. The most famous of all these empresarios was a guy named Stephen F. Austin. And Stephen F. Austin was the most famous because he was so good at getting people and convincing them to come live in what is today Texas, but then part of Mexico. He was so good at it, he recruited over 300 families to come live in what is today Texas, and again, that was part of Mexico back then. Well, the Americans that moved to Texas, remember, part of Mexico, they pretty much ignored Mexican laws in a lot of areas, including the area of slavery. These farmers that moved to Texas, they kept their slaves and ignored the fact that the Mexicans had a law against slavery. And as a result, the Mexicans didn't really like this a whole lot. And the Mexican president, whose name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Santa Anna decided that he was going to force the Texans to obey Mexican laws. And when he did this, it caused many, many problems that would lead to a war between Texas and Mexico. Again, remember, right now we're not really talking about Americans other than the Americans that are living in Texas, that are calling themselves Texans and not obeying Mexican laws. And so in 1836, the people living in Texas said, you know what? We're declaring ourselves an independent country. We're no longer part of Mexico. And when they did that, the Mexican president, Santa Anna, said, then we're going to go to war over this. And so he said, this is going to start a war because we're going to force you to follow our laws, and you can't have slaves here, and if you want to live in our country, this is how it is. But the Texans basically said, look, we're not part of Texas, we're not part of Mexico anymore. Texas is now its own country. And in 1836, Texas was its own country for the next 8 or 9 years. Well, there was some very famous battles that took place as a result of the Texas Revolution, and one of them you've probably heard of before. It was called the Battle of the Alamo. And this battle has become very, very famous. The Battle of the Alamo was the Texans against the Mexicans. There was only 188 Texans defending the Alamo. And they fought to hold it against 1,800 Mexican soldiers. And so clearly they were outnumbered, 9 to 1. For every one American, there was 9 Mexicans. For every one Texan, there was 9 Mexicans. And so clearly they had no chance. And yet for more than 2 weeks, these Texans were able to hold off the Mexican army before eventually they were overrun and they were all killed. Some of the famous people that were there, Colonel Bill Travis, maybe you've heard of before, and Davy Crockett, who I'm sure many of you have heard of before, were both there at the Alamo, and they were both killed when the Alamo was taken. Well, when they were overrun, any survivors were executed. And Santa Anna and his men were very brutal to the Texans when they caught them. In fact, at another battle the same month, Texans lost again, and the battle was called Goliad, the Battle of Goliad. And at this battle, Santa Anna executed 350 people who had given up and surrendered. Those people included women and children. And so this was a very horrific thing that Santa Anna did. And when he did that, between the Alamo and the Battle of Goliad, it really fired up the Texans and made them super mad. So mad that at the next battle, the Battle of San Jacinto, the Battle of San Jacinto basically was the turning point of the Texas Revolution. Santa Anna had chased the remaining Texans all the way to the San Jacinto River, and the San Jacinto River was, they were basically trapped there. The Texans were backed up against the river. They had nowhere to go. And so when Santa Anna and the Mexican soldiers got there, they took their time, they surrounded the Texans, and they basically went into a camp and just kind of relaxed, but at the same time they were, surrounding the Texans, but they weren't really serious because they thought the battle was basically over, that the Texans would have to surrender. Well, the Texans waited until all of the Mexican soldiers started to rest and relaxed in their camps and in their tents, and the Texans pulled off a surprise attack on the Mexicans while they were resting. And this surprise attack actually won the battle for the Texans. The Mexicans had to surrender, and essentially the battle for Texas independence was over. During the Battle of San Jacinto, the cry of the Texans was, "Remember the Alamo," and you've probably heard that before. Santa Anna was forced to sign a peace treaty, and he recognized Texas as an independent country. And when that happened, the Texas Revolution was over, and Texas was its own independent country for the next 9 or so years before eventually it would become part of the United States. The United States would annex Texas, and it would become part of the United States. And that annexing of Texas would eventually be part of what would lead to the Mexican-American War, which we'll talk about next week. Now, if you look at this picture, hopefully you can see this well on the video, but if this is a picture of a memorial that is in a historical marker that is in Texas still today, where the Battle of San Jacinto was fought, and it's really important that we understand the how meaningful this plaque is, and the Battle of San Jacinto and the Texas Revolution. If you read the plaque along with me as I read it here, and then we'll talk about it for a minute. Measured by its results, San Jacinto was one of the decisive battles of the world. The freedom of Texas from Mexico won here led to the annexation and to the Mexican War, resulting in the acquisition by the United States of the states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, Utah, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Almost 1/3 of the present area of the American nation, nearly 1 million square miles of territory, changed sovereignty. And the word sovereignty, if you don't know what that means, it means it changed hands of the government that was in control of it. And so this gives you some idea of the importance of the Battle of San Jacinto. If the Mexicans would have defeated the Texans, American history might be very different today than it was. So that's it for this Texas Revolution and what we're talking about, the battles of the Alamo and Goliad and San Jacinto. What I want you to do now is go ahead and take the quiz that goes along with this video. If you have any questions or you're not sure, go back and rewatch the parts of the video that you have questions about.